March 9th, 1996, 28-year-old Paul Templar was one of 4 guides leading a group of 6 tourists on a canoe tour down the Zambezi River in Zimbabwe. How they had it set up were there were 3 canoes, each with 2 tourists in the front, and then 1 guide in the back, and then there was 1 guide in a safety canoe all on his own. So the group were having a great time paddling down the river when Paul, the lead guide, saw they were coming up on a pod of about 12 hippos. So he signaled at the other canoes that they needed to paddle around, which the first 2 did. And then Paul turned around to check on the 3rd canoe, which was lagging behind. And as he did so, he heard this loud banging thud sound, and he saw that that 3rd canoe got hit hard from something huge underneath of it. And it sent the back of that canoe rocketing up into the air, and the guide sitting in the back of that canoe, a young man named Evans, was catapulted out of it, and he goes flying through the air, and he lands in the river. Somehow the 2 clients stayed in the canoe. Well, Paul, he turned around his canoe and paddles back to try and get Evans out of the water, because you do not want to be in the water with hippos. Well, he gets all the way up to Evans, and he's reaching out over the edge of the canoe to try and pluck Evans from the water, when right next to the canoe, all of a sudden the water just explodes, and for Paul, everything goes completely black. And at first, he can't figure out what's going on. He knows his legs are completely submerged, but the upper half of them isn't. Again, it's completely black, and it's not completely dry in there, and it's not completely wet, and he just feels this immense pressure on his lower back. Well, then he quickly figures out what everybody else in the canoes already knew, and that was when he had reached out to try and grab Evans, a huge bull hippo had come from underneath the water, and it had swallowed Paul's upper half entirely. His head and his chest and his stomach were down in this hippo's throat, and then the hippo had just pulled him off the canoe and down underneath the water. So Paul, one of his hands was free enough to where he could grab onto one of this hippo's tusks, and he uses that as leverage to try and push himself back out of its mouth. Well, this doesn't work, but luckily the hippo on its own eventually just lets him go, and Paul goes bobbing back up to the surface of the river, where right in front of him there's Evans, who is clearly in distress. So Paul reaches out to try and help Evans again, but then the hippo comes back, this time from directly underneath Paul, from the bottom of the river. It comes up with its mouth wide open, and it swallows Paul again, this time all the way up to his chest. So his legs, stomach, and chest are down inside the hippo, and just his head and his arms are sticking out. And then the hippo bites down and starts thrashing him around. And when it bites down, its tusks sink into Paul's chest and his back. So Paul grabs onto those tusks, because as the hippo is thrashing, those tusks, which are sunk inside of his body, are creating big gashes in his flesh. And he thinks if he can hold on to those, then at least that way he can prevent damage to his body. Well, eventually the hippo again lets him go on its own, and he goes back bobbing up to the surface of the water, and he's trying to swim to one of the canoes, which is very hard because at this point there's some damage to his arms, and of course his chest is pretty much ruined. Well, as he's swimming kind of like a breaststroke, he looks and sees under his left arm, and the hippo is charging him again with its mouth wide open, and it hits him right in the middle, clamping down on him. So now Paul's head is out one side of its mouth, and his legs are out the other side of its mouth. And the people in the canoes can see that it looks like it's a dog with a chew toy. This thing is just thrashing him around, and it's tearing this poor guy apart. It nearly severs both of his arms, it destroys his legs, it destroys his chest, it ruins one of his feet, and then it just takes him underwater, and it takes him basically all the way down to the bottom of the river. And somehow it's clear enough so Paul down there can see through the water. He can see it's turning red, filling with his blood. He can see the sunlight coming down, and he knows this is it. He's going to die at the bottom of this river in that hippo's mouth. But just as he realizes that he for sure is going to die, the hippo again lets him go, and he goes floating up to the surface of the river, where one of the other guides named Mac has bravely paddled up to where he was taken underwater, so that as soon as Paul comes popping up, Mac grabs him and pulls him into a canoe, and then paddles him over to a rock in the middle of the river, where everyone else has now got out of their canoes and gone on this rock to take shelter. So they pull Paul up on this rock. Paul is coughing up this pink, frothy blood, so they know he's got a sucking chest wound. Mac turns him over and finds the biggest hole, which is a giant gaping hole in his back, and Mac plugs that hole with some saran wrap off of some sandwiches and other snacks that they have, and then Mac takes off all of his clothes to make tourniquets, and makes tourniquets around his arms and legs, and then one of the guides puts Paul in one of the canoes and takes him to shore, and the hippo is still harassing the canoe at that point. Well, at that point, Paul says he had a very spiritual experience. He knew for certain that he had a choice. He could either choose to just slip off and, pass away and die, or he could choose to live. And at this point, he said he wasn't feeling any pain, but he chose to live. And he said as soon as he mentally made that choice, or spiritually made that choice, he immediately experienced the most intense pain he could ever imagine, more than he thought a human could ever endure. And he immediately regretted choosing to live. He wished he would have just chosen to die. But he somehow was able to survive for 8 hours until they got him to the hospital, where miraculously doctors were able to save one of his arms. The other one was gone at the shoulder. They weren't able to save that. And they were able to save both of his legs, despite one of his feet pretty much being destroyed. And of course, they were able to save his life, which is incredible in itself. Evans, the first guide that went in the water, the group could not find him. Evans wasn't found until 3 days later. He had just drowned, it seems like. He